Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about something pretty heavy,
Right.
actually, a really disturbing event, the Bud Dajo Massacre. So, going back to 1906, the Philippines under U.S. rule, tensions were high, as you can imagine, between the American forces and the Moro people.
Yeah, and you know what's so interesting about this is that there's a new book out called Massacre in the Clouds that really brings this event to life. It uses firsthand accounts and actual records from the Colonial archives.
Wow. So, we're talking primary sources here.
Yeah,
That's incredible. I mean, to get that kind of perspective, and to think this is something that's not really talked about a lot. So this book is kind of shedding a light on something that's been overlooked.
yeah, absolutely. And what's I think really captivating about the book is that it uses those sources to tell a story about real people. It's not just like a dry historical account.
Right.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into the human side of this tragedy.
Exact. So let's set the scene a little bit. We're talking about Mount Bud Dajo. It's a volcanic mountain on Jello Island. And this is where the Moros had retreated to after the U.S. took control of the region.
Right. They were seeking refuge.
Yeah. Imagine fleeing your home seeking safety on this mountaintop.
And what's even more tragic is that this safe haven becomes the site of this horrific massacre.
Right.
Major General Leonard Wood, who was the U.S. governor at the time, he was determined to pacify the Moros,
Right.
and he used a very brutal strategy to achieve that goal.
And, reading through the material for this episode, I was just struck by this one account from an American commander, Captain Edward Lawton,
Right.
who was there in the aftermath, and he described the mountaintop covered in corpses, just bodies everywhere.
Hard to even imagine.
I know, and the way he describes the injuries that were inflicted, just horrific.
Yeah.
And the image that really stuck with me, and I think this is in the book as well, it's the image of wounded children searching for their mothers among the dead. Just heartbreaking.
Yeah, and it's just, it speaks to the indiscriminate nature of the violence. It wasn't, targeted. It was just brutal and widespread.
And this is where, the author of the book, Kim Wagner, he makes this really thought-provoking argument.
Yeah.
He says that Bud Dajo wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of violence that was happening within the American colonial system.
Right. It wasn't an anomaly. It was
Yeah.
part of a system.
And he draws comparisons to other events like Wounded Knee and My Lay, where you see these, horrific acts of violence against indigenous populations. And then there's these attempts to cover up or downplay what actually happened.
Right, to erase it from history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder about the systemic nature of this violence.
And to understand that systemic nature, I think we need to look at the wider context of colonialism. I mean, the article that we're referencing, it highlights how the invasion of the Philippines was basically an extension of American westward expansion,
Right.
driven by this belief in a civilizing mission.
So basically the same playbook, just a different continent.
Precisely. And what's, I think, really important to understand here is how deeply ingrained this paternalistic attitude was. This condescending view of other cultures.
And the article brings up a very specific example. It mentions President McKinley's view of the Philippines
Yeah.
as this quote-unquote gift from the gods that needed civilizing and Christianization.
It's like they were justifying their actions through this lens of, we're the superior. We're the ones who need to bring enlightenment to these people.
It's that whole idea of the white man's burden, right? Like it was their duty to uplift these other races.
And it's a belief that, conveniently justified all sorts of atrocities.
All in the name of progress.
Exactly. And what I think is important to note here is that, Wagner, the author, he's not saying that American colonialism was uniquely brutal.
Mm-hmm.
He points out that, other colonial powers like the British, the Dutch, the Germans, they all employed similar tactics of subjugation and violence.
Right. So this was kind of a global phenomenon.
Yeah. It was a systemic issue rooted in colonialism itself.
And that leads to this really unsettling question that the article poses. Did this pattern of violence truly end with the colonial era?
Right. Are we still seeing this today in different forms?
And they bring up a very specific example, which I think is really going to make people think. The 2005 Editha massacre in Iraq,
Yeah.
where U.S. Marines killed 24 unarmed Iraqi civilians.
And, it makes you wonder, are these truly isolated incidents, or is there a deeper, more disturbing continuity to this kind of violence?
It's a really tough question to grapple with, but I think it's an important one to ask.
Absolutely.
And we're back. It's incredible to think that even though the Philippines gained independence in 1946, the echoes of the Bud Dajo Massacre and just that whole colonial era are still felt so strongly today.
Yeah. It's really interesting when you think about how, even after independence, a lot of the systems and institutions that were put in place during colonial rule remained.
So it's not just about like the physical scars, right? It's about those colonial practices that are still kind of woven into the fabric of Filipino society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about things like land ownership, legal structures, the education system. They all bear this imprint of that colonial past.
Right. And the article points out that land ownership in particular is a major issue.
Oh yeah, huge.
Because during the colonial era, large tracts of land were often seized from indigenous communities and then, redistributed to American corporations or Filipino elites.
Right, and that created this, legacy of land dispossession that continues to be a source of conflict.
Right, especially in areas with significant Moro populations.
Yeah, they feel like, their ancestral lands were unjustly taken from them.
And that they've been marginalized in the process of development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if the inequalities of the colonial era are just baked into the system.
Right. And so it's like, how do you even begin to unravel that?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. And that's why understanding this historical context is so crucial for understanding the challenges that the Philippines faces today.
And the article also mentions that the Bud Dajo Massacre itself continues to be a source of tension
Yeah.
between the Moros and the Philippine government.
It's a symbol of historical injustice,
Yeah.
a reminder of the violence and oppression that they've endured.
Right. And so it's like that unresolved trauma just makes it really difficult to build trust and move forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's like this sense of resentment that the government hasn't really done enough to acknowledge the wrongs of the past.
Right. And that can lead to feelings of alienation and, calls for greater autonomy or even independence.
But, amidst all of this, I was struck by the mention of the peace agreement that was signed in 2014
Oh, yeah.
between the Philippine government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front.
That was a huge moment.
Yeah.
It was like the combination of decades of negotiations.
And it seemed like this real step towards reconciliation.
And what makes it so important is that it actually acknowledged the legitimate grievances and claims of the Moro people.
So there was like a recognition of the past.
Yeah. And it paved the way for the establishment of this Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, which gives them greater control over their own affairs.
It seems like, an attempt to create a more equitable system.
It is.
But the article also mentions that the upcoming elections in the Bangsamoro region are really crucial.
Yeah, I mean, the success of this peace agreement really hinges on the ability of that Bangsamoro government to deliver on its promises, promises of peace and development.
So it's like a pivotal moment,
It
a
is.
chance to maybe break free from these cycles of violence and mistrust.
But, the transition to peace is never easy. There are going to be challenges, and it's going to require a lot of commitment and collaboration from all sides.
It's fascinating how this deep dive has connected events from over a century ago to the present day.
Yeah, it's like these historical threads are just woven into the fabric of Filipino society.
And I think that's one of the most important takeaways here. History isn't just something that happened in the past. It shapes our present and it influences our future.
Absolutely.
I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
This question of whether the pattern of violence that we see in colonialism truly ended with the colonial era. The example of the 2005 Haditha massacre in Iraq is just really unsettling.
It is. It's deeply troubling.
It makes you wonder, are these isolated incidents or are there deeper, more systemic forces at play?
It's a very uncomfortable question to ask, but I think it's a necessary one.
Is it possible that certain patterns of behavior, certain justifications for violence have persisted beyond the formal end of colonialism?
Yeah, those are tough questions, and there's no easy answers. But I think it's crucial that we engage with them honestly and critically.
And that we examine those historical parallels without, jumping to conclusions.
Right.
Because while it's important to see the connections, it's also important to recognize the unique circumstances of each situation.
Exactly. History can offer insights, it can illuminate potential patterns,
Yeah.
but it can't provide easy answers.
Right. It's not a crystal ball.
No. It's more like a lens through which we can view the present.
Yeah. It can help us understand the roots of present-day conflicts, but it's up to us to shape the future.
And to learn from the mistakes of the past.
To create a world where events like the Bud Dajo Massacre are never repeated.
Absolutely.
And we're back. As we go even deeper into this whole thing, it makes you think about how complex history really is. Like events from over a century ago. They can still have such a huge impact on what's happening today.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the Bud Dajo Massacre, as horrific as it wasn't just like a one-off thing.
Yeah.
It was part of this much larger pattern of
Right.
violence and oppression that was happening during that whole colonial period.
Right. And that context is crucial for understanding what's happening in the Philippines today.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like we're peeling back all these layers of history,
Yeah.
and it just makes you wonder, how do we even begin to deal with all the effects of
Well,
colonialism?
that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of scholars and policymakers are trying to figure that out, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
There's no magic solution. But acknowledging the injustices of the past, that's got to be the first step.
Yeah. It's like you have to recognize the wound before you can start to heal.
Exactly. And that means listening to the people who were marginalized and oppressed, you
Yeah.
know, really understanding their perspective and their
And
experience.
the article really stresses how important it is to understand the Moro perspective,
Yeah,
like their experience of the massacre and how it continues to shape their identity and their relationship with the Philippine state.
yeah. And the Moros, they have such a rich history,
Yeah.
a culture that was there long before the Americans even arrived.
Right.
And to really understand the dynamics in the Philippines today,
Hmm.
you have to understand their history and their struggles.
And the article mentions how they keep the memory of the massacre alive through these epic songs called kisa,
Right.
and they've been passed down for generations. It's like this living history.
It's powerful stuff, the
Yeah.
Kisa songs. They're a way of making sure that their story isn't forgotten.
Right.
They talk about the pain, the anger, the struggle for recognition.
It's like a reminder that trauma doesn't just disappear. It echoes through time.
Exactly. And that historical trauma is still fueling tensions between the Moros and the government.
Right. But, in the middle of all this darkness, there is a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
The article talks about the peace agreement from 2014.
Oh, yeah, between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front.
Right.
That was a huge deal.
It was. It felt like a real step towards reconciliation.
It was. And what makes it so important is that for the first time, the government actually acknowledged the Moros' grievances.
So it was like finally recognizing the injustices of the past.
Yeah, it was. And it opened the door for more autonomy in their ancestral lands.
Yeah. So hopefully it's a step towards healing those wounds from the past.
It is. But peace building is a long and complicated process.
Right. There's still so much work to do.
And the upcoming elections in the new Bangsamoro region,
Right.
those are going to be super important. The success of this whole peace agreement really depends on whether the new government can deliver on its promises. Promises of peace and development.
It sounds like a really crucial moment, like a
Yeah.
chance to break free from all the violence and mistrust.
It is. And it's going to take everyone working together to make sure this agreement actually leads to lasting peace and justice for the Moros.
It's amazing how this deep dive took us from just one historical event
Yeah.
to this exploration of colonialism, its effects, and the struggle for peace that's still going on in the Philippines.
Yeah. It's a reminder that history isn't just about facts and dates.
Right.
It's alive. It shapes us.
It's a reminder that we need to really think about history critically and learn from the mistakes so we can build a better future. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. What really stuck with you from this whole story? How does understanding the Bud Dajo Massacre and everything surrounding it, how does that shape how you see the world today? It's a lot to think about, but hopefully this deep dive gave you some new perspectives and something to really ponder. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into history and the human experience.
Thanks for coming.